Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and through them to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would also like to acknowledge Dr Marie-Louise Ayres, Director-General of the National Library, who is elected to join us here this morning. I'd also like to welcome any and all representatives of Pedal Power. I myself am a proud member of Pedal Power. My name is Daniel Gleeson. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the Library. But I'm also a very keen cyclist, and so I absolutely jumped at the opportunity to introduce this awesome panel discussion about cycling. But I must express the Library's thanks to you, Tony, for your generous philanthropic donation to the Library, which has allowed us to digitise a large selection of cycling serials and to make them freely available to everyone through Trove. They are such a wonderful resource, and I've really enjoyed going back through those serials and reminiscing about toe cage pedals, rosebank stack hats, those little cycling flags and sidewall dynamos. But I also found an editorial in the October 1930 edition of Australian Cycling, which really was despairing at calls by the New South Wales government for cyclists to contribute to the cost of building the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This was because at that time the government claimed there were more cyclists than any other vehicle on the roads of Sydney. And elsewhere there was a beautiful quote which I can't help but read to you. When one strikes form in cycling, whether on tour or in racing, one experiences the loveliest sensations. He is a master of his machine and of himself, of time and space, a potential king. So thank you so much, Tony, for your wonderful contribution. Now let me introduce our panel this morning. Tony Wheeler is an Australian publishing entrepreneur, businessman and travel writer. He co-founded the Lonely Planet guidebook company with his wife Maureen Wheeler. Tony has been described as the trailblazing patron saint of the world's backpackers and adventure travellers. Since departing Lonely Planet, Tony is kept busy with the Wheeler Institute at the London Business School, concentrating on entrepreneurship in the developing world, the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne, books, writing and ideas, the Wheeler History of Travel Writing program at Warwick University in England, and Planet Wheeler Foundation's education and health projects in the developing world. Tony's bicycle stable includes one in London, which he rode from London to Paris a few years ago, and 3 bicycles down in Melbourne. He has a folding Brompton with him today in Canberra. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr Daniel Oakman. Daniel is a writer and historian from Melbourne. During a 15-year career as a senior curator at the National Museum of Australia, he curated exhibitions about bicycles, cars, cities and urban design, including Freewheeling, a groundbreaking travelling exhibition about cycling in Australia. In 2005, his History of Australia and the Colombo Plan, Facing Asia, was shortlisted for the New South Wales History Awards. With Melbourne Books, he has published Oppie, an acclaimed biography of the sporting icon and politician Hubert Opperman, and Wild Ride in 2020, an immersive exploration of how the bicycle has long shaped understanding of the Australian continent and its people. He published his first novel, Fire in the Head, in 2025. Tony and Daniel are joined in conversation by Dr Rebecca Fleming, Senior Advisor of Digitisation Projects in the Collection Branch at the National Library of Australia. Now, Rebecca let me have a sneak peek at some of the material that she has found in the collection, which you'll see displayed this morning, and they're just fabulous. So without further ado, please join with me in welcoming Tony Wheeler, Dr Daniel Oakman in conversation with Dr Rebecca Fleming.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thank you all for coming out today. We are so excited to share with you some of the beautiful collections that have been digitised and also just have some great conversations about cycling. We have two wonderful experts here who are going to share some amazing stories, and you'll see on the screen we also have some incredible photographs that have been digitised in the collection, cycling photographs from over a century. They're just amazing. So you'll see them here in the live audience, you'll see them flick through behind us, roughly in chronological order, and for people online, some of them will pop up occasionally, but they can all be found on the catalogue. Have a search for cycling, and I think you might lose a few hours. And then, of course, go on to Trove. Now, outside, for the people in person, we have a handout with some links to the cycling journals that we've talked about. So I know you want to go and explore them and find some stories for yourself. What I'll do today is maybe bring out some highlights for you and also have a chat about all things cycling. So I'm going to start us off with a story from the 1890s. It's from the New South Wales Cycling Gazette, and it's an account of a ride from Gunning to Temora by Mr. N.T. Collins, who was an experienced cyclist who'd been riding since 1866, and Miss Josie Adams, who had been riding for less than 6 weeks. And it includes a rather dramatic passage about the rain setting in just after gas. Here we go. Before they were halfway to Binalong, the clouds gathered rapidly again, and it commenced to rain in torrents. In 10 minutes, the road was so slippery that it was impossible to ride a wheel for 100 yards without falling. Soon the night shut in, and the rain continued, while the two unhappy tourists walked on for miles, slipping and skating about in the mud and pushing their bicycles, which were gradually getting heavier and heavier with their accumulation of mud and no house or place of shelter in sight. Finally, to add to their misery, they came to a deep, wide creek, swollen by the rain, running across the road and no bridge. A search revealed a place where the creek could be crossed on stones, and it seemed like a climax to their troubles, for on the other side of the creek shone out the bright lights of a cheery home, which proved to be the homestead of the magnificent Illawong station. So the Cycling Gazette has great stories like this one, giving us insight into people's experiences, but cyclists were also keen to share their tips and advice for where people might cycle along the same path. Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about Joseph Pearson and his guidebook?
I can. He's a great way to start, I think, with Joe Pearson, who most people will have never heard of. But he kind of came of age in the great the cycling craze in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, people won't know him for his cycling feats, so he claimed that he was the first person to ride a bike to the top of Mount Kosciuszko. Some bit of colourful interpretation there. But his real claim to fame was that he fell in love with New South Wales, cycling throughout New South Wales, claimed to have covered 260,000 kilometres over his career. This is before Strava, so he measured it the hard way. What he really wanted to do was share that knowledge. So he actually produced a map, the first one in 1896, I think. And it was really, if you could imagine, a cross between a paper map and like Ride with GPS and Strava. So it was, it had all the distances between towns, where you could find water, where hotels that were welcoming to cyclists, little notes about how difficult the terrain was and how long it might take you. And this was all packaged up into a little small booklet that you could fit into the back of a jersey pocket or into your panniers when you were touring. It's sold in the thousands, and really, I think, introduced a generation of people to cycle touring. It meant Australia was still quite a forbidding place to leave the city limits, and this map helped people get out there, particularly women too, who could cycle either in smaller groups by themselves or unaccompanied, which was a rarer thing to do. His legacy actually doesn't end there. He went on to work with the New South Wales Department of Tourism, and when you see the mile markers that you still see today, they're now kilometre markers, of course, that was his idea. He advocated for that because people riding bikes like to know exactly how far it is before they get to the next resupply point. And the brown signs you see today, the tourism, that point the way to a tourist site. Again, another one of his ideas to open up New South Wales, which he never lost his love for New South Wales. He felt he didn't need to go anywhere else in the world at all. yeah, a great character in
Yeah.
Australian cycling.
Wow, that's fascinating. I never would have guessed that it was a cyclist responsible for
And
those.
look at his bicycle. It looks
Yeah.
quite modern, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's 1900.
Yeah. It's amazing. Tony, you know a lot about guidebooks. To understate it, what do you think attracts people to guidebooks and travel stories?
I think two things. One is that it does give them information on things. You know, you think about some place you just don't know about, and then suddenly you realise, hey, I can go from A to B. There is a way to do that. There is somewhere I can stay when I get there. So it's that sort of information thing. But also it's the fact that it sometimes pushes people to do things they'd sort of dreamt about, or the idea had been in their head that they could do this. And the guidebook gives them that little bit of extra inspiration. And I've always enjoyed that aspect of it. People who say, well, I wouldn't have done this if you hadn't pushed me through the door.
Wow, yeah. And it sounds like that was the case for Joseph Pearson's as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Speaking of travelling, in 1980, Paul and Charlie Farron wrote in one of the magazines, in Trocos, about tandeming, riding in the Malay Peninsula on a tandem bicycle. So I've got a little quote here about that particular experiences that they wrote. Despite warnings, we were not attacked by tigers, elephants, or communist guerrilla forces. But we did see troops of monkeys, rats, crocodiles, lizards, and after a night patrolling a lonely beach, a solitary egg-laying giant turtle. The roads were mercifully flat through endless rubber and palm oil plantations, affording much needed shade since the temperatures were up in the high 30s with maximum humidity. It was a novel situation to be drinking up to 2 gallons of fluid per day without requiring a single toilet stop. Such traffic as we encountered, and this did include a larger proportion of logging trucks, was exceptionally courteous. And then they said, having previously travelled through Asia by bus, car and train, we both agreed that our enjoyment by our close contact with people and scenery, which only the freedom and flexibility of the bicycle can provide. And Tony, we were chatting earlier and you mentioned that you knew Paul and Charlie.
Yeah, Paul unfortunately died just a few years ago, but I do know Charlie very well still, and I had lunch with her just about a week ago. And they've got a really, in Melbourne, amazing bicycle collection. Bicycles from the era when they were changing so fast. You know, there was a new development every year. You know, the penny farthing gave way to the safety bicycle. In fact, Charlie has actually ridden a penny farthing from Melbourne to Sydney. I mean, that's a
Wow.
major achievement. But their collection of bicycles is wonderful. And I must admit, I've never been up on a penny farthing. And, you know, it's a long way up there. But I have ridden some of her other old bicycles where you have to sort of approach them a bit like you did a penny farthing.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's a real bicycle enthusiast still.
Yeah, wow. So how do you approach it differently?
Well, the early safety bicycles, you approach them because they were fixed wheel, like you did a penny farthing, that you sort of pushed along behind and then jumped on from behind. You couldn't just, you know, with a modern bike, you put your leg over it and off you go. There was a different technique.
Yeah, wow. I don't think I'm brave enough for that one. I mean, that quote I found really interesting, and either of you might have thoughts on this. It feels like an early version of the slow travel movement. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, you know, bicycles, they do put you in a different context very often. And I've not done, I've got to admit, I've never done any really long bicycles. I've done 1,000 kilometres, but, you know, that's not across a whole continent or 10,000 Ks or whatever. But, you know, you do meet people more. And you mentioned that I rode from London to Paris once. I've got a place in London, and I thought, well, I need a bicycle here. So I went out and bought one, and I thought, well, now I need to try it out. And one of the things, there is a club, the Fridays it's called, in London, that does weekend rides and so on. And one of the things they do is once or twice a year, a midnight ride from London to Brighton. And you just have to turn up at Sloane Square in Chelsea at midnight, and they set off, and you should get to Brighton Pier at 5 a.m.
Oh my gosh.
And I joined in that once, and that was terrific. It was really well organised. They had a couple of stops on the way, and any difficult junction, they people there to tell you, 2 a.m., turn left here, not right, this sort of thing. So yeah, that sort of bicycle riding is a lot of fun.
You were telling us about the Brompton race as well?
Yeah, well, my Brompton is outside, fold-up bicycle. And Brompton put on an annual race in London, and you have to pretend you're a sort of business person going off to work on your Brompton. So you have to do the race with your briefcase. And the race starts with you're on one side of the road, and your folded-up Brompton is on the other side, and you have to run across the road, unfold your Brompton, put your briefcase on the back carrier, and then jump on and cycle off. And it's terrific, it's a great race. But there's always some people they've unfolded their Brompton 100, 1,000 times. But today, when it's a race, they just can't do it. They're moving the wheel the wrong way. They're not putting that. And it's so funny. And there's always somebody when they finally get away, there's a huge cheer for them.
What amazing races in London. I love it.
Oh, there's any number of races, yeah.
Daniel, what do you think about cycling and slow travel?
Slow travel. Now, I was complaining to you about this, not to drag the tone of the conversation down. The term irritates me.
Yeah.
Not because I get the impulse, which is to try and reclaim that form of travel, a more immersive kind of travel. The problem I have with it is it's the language of modernity. Slowness was the way that the bicycle was marginalised in Australian culture very readily. Australia, rushed to embrace the bicycle in the 19th century, a great fervour behind it, but they turned their back on it just as quickly in the 1940s. And one of the ways they did that was to mark it out as being slow. Yeah. If you read the highway codes, I have, so you don't have to.
Oh, good.
That is the very thing. It's the slowness of the bicycle. It's obsolete technology. It's the motor car that's the future. So bikes had to be, weren't allowed to go through intersections, highways, a series of things that marginalise it in a more formal sense. So that's why the term just rankles me a little bit, even though I get the impulse. And I don't think bikes are actually slow. I mean, a couple of months ago, a fellow from Canberra rode from the tip of Cape York to Wilson's Promontory in 35 days. That's not slow.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
No,
it's
that's
a
true.
remarkable form of transport. I think we need to resist that.
Yes, bikes aren't slow.
Yeah.
I wonder what words we might use then to describe what that article is talking about, which is connection, I suppose, with the land and with the landscape you're in, which you don't get as much, or maybe even at all when you're in a car.
No, I remember I mentioned that my new bike, after I'd done the midnight ride, London to Brighton, I then did a ride from London to Paris. No hurry at all, but the first day I just rode from London down to the Channel and spent the night in the bed and breakfast and took the ferry across to France the next day and stopped somewhere out in France and carried on. And I eventually got close to Paris and I thought, well, I could ride into Paris tonight, but I don't want to be sort of fighting with the rush hour. I'll stay at a hotel on the outskirts of Paris and go into Paris in the morning. And in the morning, I got on my bike and I just rode to more or less the first roundabout I came to and wasn't quite sure which way to go and stopped and was looking at a map. And a French cyclist pulled up beside me and said, I can see, you've got your pannier on the bag, you've come some distance. And I said, yeah, I'm just riding into Paris and I'm not sure which junction to take. And he said, I work in the centre of Paris, follow me. So I had this guy, on his morning commute into work to follow, and he knew all the go down this street the one way, the wrong way, and cut through this park and so on. It was terrific.
Wow.
It was a really nice introduction to it, and it was totally by chance and by a local cyclist.
Amazing. It says a lot about cycling community, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely did.
Yeah, and you can see that in the magazines as well. Pedal Power and the strength of community. And part of the magazines are really giving advice to each other. This is what one of them is a person saying what they pack in their pannier for a long trip. It's
that
fascinating.
serendipity too.
Yeah.
Those moments that just happen by chance.
Yeah, amazing. And one of the topics that I find come up quite a lot in the magazines are weather and food. And there's a Bicycle Institute of Victoria article which gives some advice on food to maintain energy. It said food is also best taken in small amounts frequently to maintain your energy. You need high energy food, but avoid sugary sweets which give you all the energy in a burst. Best of all is what bushwalkers call scroggin. It's a mixture of dried fruits, nuts, chocolates and seeds such as sesame and sunflowers. And it's perhaps an indication that I've spent too much of my life in a library that I hadn't heard of scroggin. But it's very clear to everybody else. Daniel, has nutrition and food always been an important part of cycling?
Yeah, always. I think when you've got the passenger is the engine, needs fuel, it's always been a topic. And I mean, cycling and food's always been, the commercial dimension to its evolution. And the first overlanders were, well, they didn't have access to, of course, packaged food, so they often set off with a bag of flour and a firearm and was expected to sort of hunt along the way. But one aspect of the history that I learned about through the National Library's archives was the arrival of kind of diets, faddish diets. By the 1930s, those kind of diets were starting to become more embraced by cyclists. Yeah. One of them being, of course, Hubert Opperman, who was always looking for a kind of competitive edge. And he embraced what was called the hay diet. It was for a New York doctor who had come up with this concept. It was actually Oppie's wife that managed his diet, I should say. And one of the key principles of the hay diet, which we would recognise today, was a mix of carbohydrates and sugar. Oppie's favourite was pineapple sandwiches.
Oh, okay.
This is what fuelled his, were being handed out the car window as he was cycling across the country. But you can see a mix of carbohydrates and sugar in the fruit were what he was being fuelled by. He also took up, not controversially, it might sound like a South American herbal remedy. It's not those kind of herbs. It was yerba mate. So it had all the herbs, but had all the stimulants that are in tea and coffee. Right. And that was his secret ingredient. And still doing it today, aren't we?
Yeah. Wow. So the kind of professional cyclists are still thinking about food and how to best maximise those seconds.
Yeah. Continually.
Yeah, wow. Tony, do you have any memories of great food while cycling, or do you have any go-to food that you take with you?
Well, I think, the carbohydrates thing. I said I joined in for 1,000 Ks, the annual bike ride that goes from Cairo to Cape Town. It lasts for 4 months, and I spent 2 weeks with them. Through Tanzania and Malawi. And it was amazing how much food you could knock back. You got there at night, and, that pasture, I'll have a second go at it sort of thing. You do burn the calories. But also, I remember on that London-Paris bike ride I did, the night I spent at a hotel out in the country, and, I was thinking, God, they talk about the French and great food. Well, I've had some really bad meals in France, but tonight this is terrific. But of course, what it is, you are bloody hungry. And that makes a lot of food terrific.
That's true. I remember landing in London when I was very jet lagged once, and it was the best bacon sandwich I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was, but. So the weather is another topic that I'm sure everybody here on very cold Canberra mornings is very aware of. And one example in a 1993 BV News article outlines the different types of gloves that was good for cold mornings. And the article suggested that the best value was a pair of work gloves for $3.20 from McEwen's with cotton backs and leather palms. The luxury option was a long-wristed fur-lined leather mitts from the City Centre Army Disposals Unit for $19.95, which I suspect it might be a bit more than that now. Daniel, in your research or your experience as a cyclist, have you come across any good tips for keeping warm in cycling?
Yeah, look, I've been riding in Canberra for 20 odd years, which I think makes you an expert almost by default. But I've spent hundreds of dollars searching for good gloves, and I actually started using gloves that were used on oil rigs. So they had a battery in the back that you could charge, so it heated an element. But actually, even they weren't good enough for a sub-zero Canberra morning. And it wasn't until I started looking at what they call pogies. Now, rowers use pogies because they fit over the end of an oar, much the same way as you could fit them over the end of a bicycle handle. So all the gears and brakes are inside, put your hands in. They came out of sort of polar expeditions, so polar explorers could keep their hands warm and have their food in there so it didn't freeze. So I started using these in Canberra. So effective that my hands would get too hot. I would have to take them out, have them cool down and put them back in again. So, pogies, that's my tip.
Great, you're ready for the -5 mornings.
Yeah.
Of course, cycling is also one extreme to another. And there's another article I found about, and it was Simon Leonard. He was describing cycling in the heat of what was then known as Yugoslavia in 1981 down the Adriatic coast in 43-degree heat. And he gives us an insight into that. There were no shady camping spots and villages that were distances apart. I had to keep moving, hence my rapid education in cycling in hot conditions. Access to the unbelievably blue, clear Adriatic was frustratingly sporadic, but taken advantage of whenever the road meandered close by it. I'd leap in with shirts, socks, shorts, dark glasses and peaked caps still on, pausing only to remove shoes and watch. The air was so parched I'd be bone dry again within 15 minutes. I had a water carrying capacity of 7 to 8 pints, which is nearly 4 times the normal daily requirement, which by sipping constantly I maintained the body's electrolyte mineral salt balance. My cap and shirt were frequently dampened, keeping in mind the amount of drinking water left and the distance to the next likely water supply. Even so, before reaching this balance, I had experienced dehydration, weaving about the road, dotted and blurred vision, and a reckless attitude. Tony, what have you experienced similar weather challenges?
Not that bad. But yeah, one of the things about, liquid intake on bicycles, you very often don't realise how dehydrated you're getting. Because, the breeze is cooling you. And I'm very bad at not drinking enough water. And when I start getting cramps in my legs, I think, well, I have failed on this. I have not been... my intake of liquid has not matched the requirements.
Yeah. Have you had really cold cycling experiences as well?
Yeah, the gloves question is one. But going back to cycling gear and bicycles and so on, I remember we called them Boris bikes in London. We still do, even though Boris is no longer long gone from being the London mayor. And since the mayor is Sadiq, they should be Sadiq cycles rather than Boris bikes. But after they've been in about 5 years, there was an article about them once saying it's amazing that Boris bikes have been out there for 5 years and hundreds of thousands of bicycle hires, and there's still never been a fatal accident on a Boris bike. And someone said, well, yeah, they're not wearing Lycra. So maybe there's an attire thing that keeps you safe.
Yeah, maybe. Do they have helmets with those? Like with our bikes here or scooters, the bikes have helmets with them?
No. There's no helmet. I mean, that's been one of the things they've said why cycle hire in Australia, but bikes of that nature have always had a problem because you are required to, by law, a lot of people don't, to wear helmets, whereas in other countries you're not, and that does make a difference.
Some of you might, I don't know if it's popped up yet on the screen, but there's a great photo of shearers riding around in bikes, and there's an article in Pedal Power Tasmania that describes the importance, historians writing about it at this point, the importance of bicycles for shearers who travelled from Tasmania up to Victoria and then had a season shearing, and their method of transport was bicycles. And you can see at some point the photographs will pop up there. But there's a lovely quote where I'll just read to you his description of that experience, of what those people experienced. So he says, so many rode them that the New South Wales Pastoralist Union Sheds Hand Agreement eventually included a clause requiring property owners to provide sheds as well as food, bunks and other amenities for the contract workers. And the bicycle was an excellent transport device for their purposes. It could carry heavy loads and was durable, reliable and fast. A cyclist can consistently cover 2 to 3 times as much distance in a day as by horse or walking, and the bike needed no food or water, an invaluable asset in drought-prone eras. And that article was by Dr Jim Fitzpatrick. Dan, you were telling me an interesting story about the industry of creating bikes. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Particularly around that, that period you're sort of talking about, late 19th century, early 20th century. It was an incredible bike manufacturing industry in Australia, and really almost every small town that they would import tubular steel, often from the UK, and they could weld up a bicycle. So there was a sort of a micro industry right across the country. But the interesting part of that for me was when Melbourne Star and Oppie arrive on the scene in the 1920s and 30s. It actually poses a threat to that that industry, partly because Bruce Small, who's the brainchild behind really Melbourne Star's expansion, was an especially aggressive marketer. Really, one of the first national marketing campaigns is with Melbourne Star, and he used Oppie to, as well as a racer, he would go out as a salesman and set up agencies in all these different towns. So when Melbourne Star arrived, your little business was under threat. And when that story is sort of lesser known, it's not part of the Melbourne Star Oppie mythology, but that was going on. And not everyone thought Oppie was a great. They knew he was a champion, but it was going to put you out of business.
Yeah, interesting. And what do you know about that whole era of kind of bike packing from the shearing perspective?
The thing that always strikes me, and just listening to you read that quote, is to think about what Australia was like back in those times. And it was actually, of course, there was a greater number of people living outside the cities. So it was actually easier, in one respect, to ride long distances because you could expect to find a homestead, or even like following the overland telegraph from Adelaide to Darwin. At least every 200 kilometres there was a repeater station, some sort of homestead. So you could just inch your way across the country. It's not to say it was easy, but you could expect to find some form of water and food and purchase it along the way. So the shearers were also doing that. Some of them were going from the eastern seaboard across to Western Australia, following similar kind of pathways.
Yeah, wow. And obviously the people in the homesteads expected to just have people show up and support them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they could also make a little bit of money from this sort of form of transport.
Fascinating. And Tony, can you tell us a little bit more about the phenomenon of bike packing as a mode of travel and how that might have changed?
People do. It's a very enjoyable way of travel. We've sort of denigrated slow travel in a way, but it is not as fast as driving places. You are seeing things at a more reasonable speed, and you need that lunchtime stop or that mid-afternoon break or whatever. Which in a vehicle you think, I should stop. I've been driving for too long. But on a bicycle, you've got to stop. So it is a different approach. Just going back to, we were talking about the shearers using bicycles as a means of work. It's amazing how bicycles in the last 5 years really have really come back as an employment thing. We're driven crazy by them, the delivery cyclists, but they're certainly part of everyday life now, much more than they were 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess it is that more flexible mode of travel that in clogged up cities you can get through with a bike.
It's fascinating because there was a period maybe 20 years ago when the bicycle message delivery was a big deal, and then that was sort of email and the internet sort of killed that. There were so many cities. I knew there'd be a place where you could see the cyclists gathering. I knew the place where they gathered in Melbourne. I knew the place where they gathered in San Francisco, and there was they were delivering all day, and then sort of 4 or 5 o'clock they'd sort of gather there for a chat session, and then that completely disappeared. Things weren't being delivered by cyclists anymore because you could email it. These things, they come and go, don't they?
Cycling is proving to be very persistent, as you say.
Yeah, it is. It disappears in one respect,
yeah, it comes back.
It pops up in another.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting talking about cities and how different it must be to ride in different ones. You were telling me an interesting story about what it's like to ride in Melbourne.
Well, in Melbourne, any cyclist learns about tram tracks. The tram tracks are the Melbourne killer, and you very quickly learn you've got to keep out of them. Because once your wheel's in a tram track, you're down. And you learn to avoid that. But of course, every now and then, some stupid car pulls out and you swerve to go round it, and you swerve to go round it, and you're into the tram track. And once you've got a cycle wheel in a tram track, you are down. I've had stitches from Melbourne tram tracks. But it's not just getting your wheel into it. If it's raining, they are like ice. You don't have to get your wheel on it. Just going across it, you can be slipped up. So Melbourne tram tracks, beware.
What's it like riding in London, just around the place?
Well, London has improved a lot in recent years with dedicated bicycle lanes. There's a lot more of them than there were. Not enough, but there's a lot more than there were. But I think one of the problems, and I see this in Australia and in London, is this places you go to where are parks and they say no cyclists, this park, this laneway is just for pedestrians only. And there's no pedestrians there at all. I can see for the next mile there's no pedestrians. And if there was one, they can have that side and I'll have this side. And yet the bicycles are banned. I'd like bicycles to get into places a bit more in some places.
Yeah, there's certainly parts of Europe where that system is going, where there's pedestrians on one side and
and cycles the other.
Yeah. And what's it like for you riding in Canberra?
Well, your Canberra is kind of interesting, isn't it? It's part of its the Canberra story is that it has a wonderful cycling network. I think partly true. Most of Canberra's cycling network was developed in the 70s and 80s, in part out of the OPEC oil crisis, which changed the way a lot of urban planning was done, and bicycles were seen as sort of a real solution, in creating sustainable, non-oil, fossil fuel dependent transport. I think Canberra has a great recreational network. It's kind of commuter network. Now that's another thing entirely. And if anyone, and many people here, will have attempted to ride down Northbourne Avenue, one of the major arterial roads, and it's it's frightening, And many cyclists have died on these commuter networks. So I think there's huge improvements that need to be made. There's too much compromise, which usually results in the cyclist being sort of almost literally pushed off the road. So I think still a lot of work to do.
I actually rode my bicycle in from the airport yesterday, and the bicycle lane actually starts at the airport.
Wonderful.
I was quite astonished. I came out of the airport and there's the freeway, and there's a bicycle lane by the freeway.
Yeah.
That was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, amazing. So great that you cycled to this event. That's the best way to do it. One of the great things I've been noticing reading the magazines is how cycling is accessible to lots of people. And there's this, in the 1980s, there was a great article written by Marjorie Barrett about cycling and when she just had a baby. She was pregnant and then having a baby, so she was thinking about cycling with family. I'll read you this quote. She talks about the baby arriving and how this might change her cycling. Enter Ruth, a tiny, floppy baby. Until then, going anywhere usually meant cycling. How could I manage now? Surely I needed both hands to hold her, leaving none for the handlebars. The answer was the tandem. She had her first ride at 2 weeks in a carrier strapped to my chest. As stoker, I did not need to worry about steering, brakes and gear change, and I had one hand free to hold the baby if necessary. Tony Maureen wrote a book for Lonely Planet called Travel with Children not long after this article was published. Was that a period where people were starting to think more about how to incorporate children into travel?
Yeah, it certainly was. And I remember you were talking about, cycling with small children. My daughter, her first year of school, I used to cycle her to school every morning. My office was quite close to the school she went to, and I had a bicycle seat on the back of my bike, and I put her in there in the morning, and as we passed the people who stopped the traffic for kids crossing the road, she'd wave to them. It was part of family life, the bicycle ride every morning.
Oh, lovely. Did you have any challenges travelling with kids at all?
Oh yeah. There's a lot to be said for travelling with kids. It's amazing how you go to countries where travelling by yourself, you're just another tourist. And suddenly, if you've got kids with you, you're a human being. A whole different approach. And I remember when our daughter was very small, we were in Malaysia with her. And we'd go into a restaurant, and they'd see that we were, managing the kid and eating as well. And they'd just come and she was gone. Took her away. And we didn't see her till the meal was over. And she came back quite happy that she'd been back in the kitchen preparing our meals. Even though she couldn't talk yet. But
Wow. Daniel, the article we were just quoting is a really interesting insight into women and cycling. And I wonder if you could tell us, you hinted a little bit earlier about women's experience. Could you tell us a bit more? And about Sarah Maddox and why she's significant?
Yeah, I think, the subject of women in cycling is, I think, one of the most fascinating histories, and I knew we were going to talk about Sarah Maddox, and I was actually thinking about how could I sort of introduce this in a different, more interesting way. And actually, I was reading an article last weekend in the Good Weekend, the magazine with the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was about Georgie Howe, who was writing for a pro team, Australian-based pro team, J.K. Allure. So this is in the 2010s, and she was talking about the way, the kind of the brutal training regime that she was put under, where the expectation was that if she was still having her periods, she wasn't training hard enough. And I think, so this is in the 2010s. If we cast our minds back 120 years, the same kind of issues around women and their bodies and what would happen to them when they started cycling was still, as contentious in a slightly different way, with a lot of people thinking that if women rode bikes, their ovaries were going to fall out, or this was, incredible things were going to happen. That's to introduce Sarah Maddox, who came along. She was apparently the first woman to cycle from Sydney to Melbourne. This is in 1894, I think. She did some other kind of big trips as well, Sydney to Brisbane and back. What made her different was that she insisted on riding in a dress. She believed that, or her kind of political statement, if you like, was that a woman could still ride and remain feminine. At the time, this was hugely controversial, what a woman would ride when she was cycling, and it was around the time of rational dress. So this was really a shirt and knickerbockers, but it was seen as masculine. So in the debates at the time, it was seen, well, if a woman started riding, she would become almost a quasi-man. So Sarah's position was, no, you could do all these things and look graceful and feminine. She wrote about all her trips in cycling magazines, wrote about how women could modify their dresses so they wouldn't get blown up in the wind, all these sort of things. And she was hugely influential, took tours around Sydney, and a real icon, I think, of that early period.
We were talking about the Farrens and their bicycle collection, and Charlie Farren is a big proponent of this idea, and as well as the bicycles, they've got a sort of a wardrobe department, so you can wear the appropriate clothing. You've got an 1890s bicycle, and you can be dressed in 1890s gear as well. And Charlie says, how bicycles were really emancipating. It gave women a means of transport that just wasn't available before. That she's a big proponent of the feminine side of bicycle riding.
Absolutely. And you can see a few of there's photos, more modern photos at the moment, but some of the earlier photos you would have seen, there's women in the long dresses. So perhaps inspired by Sarah Maddox. Or they've just, it became regular then.
It just became normalised.
And the touring is really interesting when you think about, solo female touring and things. This is not new. People like Sarah were leading tours earlier. Really interesting. Probably one of the most obvious things looking at the magazines is the cycling community. We've talked about, the sharing tips, sharing places you can go together. And I was wondering, Tony, Lonely Planet has been a Bible for so many people. As a traveller and a cyclist, what sources do you use to build community and learn from others?
Well, the best community is always other people doing these things. Lonely Planet for a long time had this area on their website called the Thorn Tree, which were messages that you put up. In Africa, you pinned them up on a thorn tree, and there still is. I went there just a year or so ago in the centre of Nairobi, a cafe with a thorn tree notice board, and it takes its technique from that. But other people doing things, that community is always the best way. You want to do something, you put a message out and say, has anybody else got an idea? How did you do it? And sure enough, someone will come back and tell you.
Yeah. And that seems to, it's evolving. Daniel and I were talking about sources and how things become more ephemeral with things like Instagram. But I know there's a cyclist in Canberra called Stephanie Skinner, who does the magpie. She talks about she tries out different ways to avoid getting attacked by magpies. It's on Instagram. It's very funny. But I'm wondering, Daniel, if you might reflect on how sources and networks change.
Why do magpies hate cyclists? I mean, that's much more so than pedestrians, isn't it?
It seems to be a vendetta.
Yeah.
Has someone written the history of that?
I'm sure
That might be your next book, Daniel.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wonder about where these stories,
Yeah.
because of all these fabulous collections that are here, the written sources, now that magazines are dwindling and everything's gone pretty much digital, how is that being recorded?
Yeah.
The ephemeral nature of Instagram. There's a lot of that community is, it's very, the reach is tremendous, but it doesn't just disappear.
Yeah. Yes, I know we record websites, so that's one way that they're preserved. The other thing that you see in things like Pedal Power, that advocacy is so strong in the cycling community. That's one of the things I've noticed. But also, there's fashion. When we're talking about the women's riding, there's and you can see it in the photographs how often it's changed. The different, how has cycling fashion changed over the years?
It's, again, one of the most fascinating dimensions of these collections is to look at that. The early fashion, of course, was mostly natural fibres, cotton and wool, which is actually starting to make a comeback. Everything old is new again. I think it's really interesting when the chamois gets invented in the 1930s, and it's made of leather. Deer leather was the preferred leather, which had to be made soft by the application of chamois cream and I think a hammer, which is the only way to become comfortable. And then synthetic. In the 1950s, you've got the synthetic fibres, nylon, and that's really we're still, I think, predominantly using that kind of material. Another thing I do find in the collections is the use of leather, dog leather, dog skin leather, for use of gloves because it was thinner. Yeah, until the 1950s. Sorry.
Didn't expect that one. There you go.
I didn't. Never heard of that.
Tony, I was thinking about fashion and travel, and I wonder if what you've packed over the years, what do you think about when you pack for travel?
Well, I think of can I get it in the overhead locker in the plane? Because one thing, I had to wait for my bike to come off the luggage yesterday at Canberra Airport, and that's an activity I generally avoid. If I can just travel with a carry-on, I always do. And my view on this is when you're traveling, you're meeting different people every day. They don't realise you only have a blue shirt, a red shirt, and a white shirt. There's only three of them. One's on my back. One's drip drying beside the shower. That there's to wear and a spare. That's all you really need. So you do need far less than you would think. And I always look at people with these gigantic bags. And I think, my God, how long are you going for? Is this a 2-year trip you're setting out for? No, if you can carry it on for a month easily.
Yeah, I have learned that myself by dragging suitcases around and not enjoying it.
You don't want to, no.
But cyclists are very good at packing light, aren't they? And one of the things I've seen in the magazines is different tips for panniers and what to pack. It's certainly something that seems to be shared. Daniel, I was just before we, in about 5 minutes, we might do some questions. So start thinking of any questions you have. But I might just ask you, we mentioned Oppie earlier. Could you tell us about Oppie and the races in Australia and how that's developed?
Yeah, probably, I can't really think of another more famous cyclist, and one of the reasons why I was surprised to, as his biographer, I was really surprised that it hadn't been done before, given how famous he was. Really, I think someone that became synonymous with cycling and kind of sporting achievement, as famous as Don Bradman and Farlap, but really forgotten in more recent times, which is kind of an interesting story in itself. I think maybe becoming a politician didn't necessarily help his expand the fan base, if you like. But anyway, I still found him endlessly fascinating. And actually, one of my favourite stories about Oppie is not really about he had hundreds of epic rides here and around the world, but actually was when he was on the steamship going to ride in his first Tour de France in 1928. 6-week journey, so you're going to lose a lot of fitness on that that
right.
trip. And he was riding the rollers on the deck of the ship, and one of the other passengers came along and recognised him, of course, and said to one of his teammates, what's he doing? And they said, well, he's actually providing power for the ship. And she said, well, keep up the good work. I like it tells you something about, the mythology around this individual, this sort of Titanic person.
Well, I'm sure with the cyclists we have in this room, we could probably power the library.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I could talk to you both all day. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I will leave a little bit of time for questions, and then I believe some people will be going for a ride at 11:30, maybe fuel up. We've talked about how important that is at Book Plate on the way out. But if anybody has any questions here or online, do let us know, and we'll see if we can answer them. Hey Mel, I think do we have mics?
Yes, but first, if you don't mind, Rebecca, I do have a question from someone watching online.
Great. Yeah.
Mark Sebastian asks, what role does class play in the development of cycling in Australia starting in the 19th century?
Great question. I'm going to throw to Daniel.
It's really significant because, of course, the early bicycles were expensive. So it was, predominantly kind of middle class people that were really taking up the bicycle. But as I mentioned earlier, very quickly, with the importation of tubular steel and this micro industry spread out right across the country, so the price of bikes fell very quickly. Earlier bikes were, the penny farthings, of course, were a bit restricted to sort of very athletic young men. But as soon as it moved to the safety bicycle, the price came down. And then it was much more egalitarian. You had, doctors and things riding bicycles in cities, but equally there could be shearers, from the working classes also on a bike as a much more economical form of transport than the horse. So it was a revolution. Very quick revolution in that sense.
Actually, going back to the Charlie and Paul Farron again, their collection they built up, they said part of the reason they were able to start building it so easily in Melbourne was at the stage when bicycles were developing and changing very rapidly, and as you say, they were expensive. And at that point, Melbourne was a city that had a hell of a lot of money. So people were able to indulge in, buying a new bicycle was like buying a new sports car. And as a result, there were a lot of bicycles, old ones, when they started collecting them, available.
And that's happening again, really, isn't it, with the fancier bikes? Different
Well,
types. You've got to have different types of bikes.
We were talking about electronic gear changes before we came down here.
Marie-Louise?
A question for either of you. I'm kind of asking about what you know about the change of the relationship between bicycles and children over time. I just reflect that when I was a kid, and I'm sure lots of people in the audience were similar, got my first bike when I was 8, it was second-hand, Dad repainted it, then I got a new one when I was 12. You now see completely competent cyclists of 3. So what's the what happened early on with kids? When did kids really get into bikes, and how has that changed over time?
I mean, look, from what I know about, some cycle design, kids' bikes weren't really a thing until sort of mid-20th century, 1940s. So if you wanted to ride a bike before that, you were having to adapt to an adult-sized bike, which probably excluded a lot of children from learning to ride. But since then, I think since the 50s, then there's the kind of diversification of the cycle industry has been huge and ever changing. But
Yeah, they've got my niece and nephew have ridden those balance bikes as well. So which might have helped with the younger kids being able to ride it much earlier than I could. I was very bad at it. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yep. Caroline?
I was interested in the topic of advocacy, which came up quite a bit. And this is really a question for Tony, but I was interested in the partnership that grew between cycle advocacy groups and small rural towns and rail trails.
Well, you know, I really don't know anything about this, and yet, as soon as you said that, the first thing I thought of was in Japan, where there's a lot of, you know, bicycles available at train stations, and the ability to ride from one train station to another train station. But yeah, I mean, it's something that certainly there's lots of places in Australia. I think of Beechworth, you know, in northern Victoria, which has, it's a place you get on a bike and you ride downhill from Beechworth to Bright. You know, it's an old cycle track that follows what was a railway line once upon a time. And, you know, could be doing more of this. We could be making bicycles available at one place that you can pick it up here, ride it to there, drop it off there, and between train stations is an excellent idea.
Yeah.
Yes, good morning. I have two questions, if I may.
Sure.
The first was possibly your worst experience with puncture repair and how that's progressed over the years. Like when I was young, we used to have the vulcanised rubber, strike a match and burn it and take ages to repair. The second one, possibly more controversial, is what's your thoughts on the advent now of EVs, electric bicycles, and the speed that they go, and what impact that might have on pedal power as well, rather than just them by themselves?
I tell you, my most interesting bicycle puncture things have all been in the developing world. You know, in India, if you get a puncture, sure enough, there's going to be someone within, you know, a couple of 100 meters who's going to... I've ridden into little Indian villages, you know, and damn it, I punctured the tyre just before I got there. And I look around, there's the puncture repair place. You know, it's much better than our modern society in that respect. Yeah, we don't like punctures on bicycles. I certainly don't have any affection for them at all.
You got any puncture stories?
Oh, the only one that pops into my mind is riding around Wagga Wagga in the cathead season. It's like a machine gun tearing through the tyre. But it's on the e-bike question. I think it's, you know, an interesting one. Lots of you know, heavy moral and sort of ethical overlay on people's decision to take up an e-bike. I think that for me the real issue is if the motorisation of that transport, you know, away from human power, starts to impact the way urban planners operate and start designing cities around if they see the e-bike as like it's a motorbike, isn't it? Is it just essentially a small car, rather than a human-powered vehicle that is very efficient but vulnerable, needs to be treated in a different way. So that's my worry, that the e-bike, if it becomes the dominant mode...
Yeah. The legal aspects really haven't been sorted out.
Yeah.
But as you say, a lot of e-bikes are as powerful as small motorcycles, or more. And yet on the other hand, you know, people who just think, you know, I'd like to be on two wheels, but I haven't got the physical ability to do it.
Yeah.
You know, and the e-bike bridges that gap. So there's pluses and minuses, and we need to work them out.
Yes, very complicated. I don't think we'll do it in the next 2 minutes.
No.
Question for Tony. Maps, cycle guides, all that stuff which has been a large part of your working life. Is there a place still for paper maps? Most of us these days when we ride, we have a cycle computer which often have maps on it. We also carry an iPhone or a phone of some sort which has maps on it. But those maps don't really provide cycle-safe routes. Now, personally, when I go to a new area, a new town, I'll go to the local tourist information centre and ask for the local cycle map, which has the bike paths, the safe routes on it, and often they do have them. What's your view on the future of paper maps?
Oh, look, I still love paper maps. I've got to say, though, that a lot of the electronic mapping these days, you know, does have, you can choose, do you want the walking route, the cycle route, or the car route, that they do cover all three. But yeah, you know, paper maps, we are losing them, and I hate to see it happen. But we really have to, you know, you have to balance both fields, both the electronic and the and the paper versions. I mean, in Melbourne, the old Melways, I was actually going through something just a day or two ago, and I found a Melways. I thought, what's happened to Melways? I'm sure they don't print them anymore. I mean, who would use a Melways? It's a piece of ancient history.
Well, people would be losing the skills to
And
read
how
about
to
as
do
well.
it, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, there used to be, you told people what your location was by your, it's page 58 and it's A4. That's where I live. It means nothing at all anymore.
Do we have any more online or in person? Oh, another question there.
Thank you very much. You've both been involved in travel and movement and observations of this over so many years. I'd welcome any thoughts, please, about the level of cycling and what factors encourages that, or that you feel have encouraged that, and perhaps is it a matter of culture, or is it a matter of the macro level of legislation? Is it a matter of in this modern age, is it the sort of people that inspire others to get out there? Welcome any thoughts on the participation of culture that you've seen.
I think it's really it's all these factors. It's safety, that you have special bicycle lanes, and keep the bikes and cars don't mix, and people feel safer on a city where cycle lanes are available, so that encourages bicycles. But also the mere fact that when you get there, you're there, you haven't got to spend the next hour looking for a parking space. That's a major advantage of bicycles. Just when we were developing this idea for the meeting today, there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think it was, saying about how successful the bicycle hire thing had been in London, how the fact that now there are all sorts of other not locked-in bicycles like the Boris bikes, but nevertheless the Boris bikes were still surviving really well. And at the same time, there was an article in the Economist looking at the growth of bicycles in cities, and the city they chose was Montreal, where bicycles have been amazingly successful. And anybody who knows Montreal knows that, cold in the winter, you have no idea how cold it can be in the winter, and yet Montreal was a city where bicycles have really become successful. So who knows?
Yeah, I think for me it's more a question about how do you normalise cycling, and I think as we were talking about earlier, Australia is a country where it was normalised and it really collided, almost literally in some cases, with the car culture. And how do you rebuild cycling culture? And so it's all those things. For me as a historian, that I think history is part of that. That's part of the cultural imaginary that supports any given practice. History is a part of that. And in my tiny way, I hope that that the stories we keep telling reminds people that Australia was a cycling nation, still is, but we just tend to forget a little bit about the depth of it at times.
Absolutely.
China is a really interesting place for this, because China, during the communist era, owning a bicycle was something you did want to, you esteemed to be doing. I think owning a bicycle was enormously important. And then they had this period when they were trying to drive bicycles off the road. We want to build cars, and and they were too successful. They did get rid of the bicycles. The cars flooded everything, and now they're reversing that. They're going back to bicycles. And you go to China today, and there are a hell of a lot of fashionable bicycles. It's getting more like cycle riding here. They aren't the boring old flying pigeon bicycles. They're modern, colourful, technicoloured bicycles. So it's China, things have happened really fast. Bicycles built up, bicycles went down, bicycles are building up again.
Wonderful. We'll ride the wave. One more, sorry, over this way.
Thank you. Do you have a bicycle that you're particularly fond of, or you wished you owned, and what was it that was special about that bike?
We were talking before about how many bicycles we have. I've only got 4 at the moment. I've got one in London, one in Canberra, and 2 in Melbourne. One of the bicycles I've got is actually made of plywood. A guy I know in Melbourne had a fascination about it. His first plywood bicycle was a really sort of Fred Flintstone thing. It could have been on the cartoon. And he developed them more and more and more. And the one that I've got is a real work of art. It was all designed on computer and the layers glued together. And it's scarcely any heavier than a modern carbon fibre bicycle. It's a real... I don't use it every day, but when I do use it, people are always asking questions about it. Now, I'm trying to think of the place in Denmark where what's the bicycle they make there? I can't think of it. A really wonderfully old-fashioned bicycle that they turn them out still in this commune area in Copenhagen. Anyway, bicycles.
Is there any bike you particularly want?
No, I'm pretty utilitarian, and it's anything that makes it easier. That's my attitude.
That's fair. Do we have any other questions? Oh, yep, over here. Hang on. You're getting a mic in a sec.
Yesterday, Pedal Power, the local cycling organisation, celebrated its 50th anniversary in a ride from Woden to Civic. And our history is very well documented in the Canberra Cyclist, a magazine which has sadly given way to the digital newsletter, which is nowhere near as good. So, Rebecca, has the National Library got a collection of the Canberra Cyclist?
I believe we do. So I might get someone, I'll double check the catalogue, but I believe I do recall seeing some pedal power related material, yeah.
We can help you out.
Yeah. Good to know. Okay, thank you. We might chat.
Thank you, everyone. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but that was just such a great conversation. And thanks to everyone for those excellent questions. If today's talk has inspired you by all things bikes and riding, I'm sure you're all aware that we're going on a bike ride at 11:30. So that ride will be led by Pedal Power. Many thanks to Pedal Power. It starts at 11:30 at the base of the library podium stairs. So there's plenty of time to grab a cycling fuel, which is a lovely coffee. No one loves coffee more than cyclists, before going on that. Look, thank you everyone for coming to the library today. And can I have a round of applause, please, for Rebecca, Tony and Daniel.